And thank you for coming. I'm very happy to see so many faces here, especially because you paid. I think that's for German audience. It's still very unusual that you would pay to listen to someone speak. So I hope we will do our best to entertain you.
Provide true money value.
Yes. Yes, we were asked here because of this exhibition, Things We Don't Understand, and it's very interesting that you gave this title as Rendering Visible, or subtitle, Rendering Visible the Excluded, because we tried to figure out how this came about, and we looked at our texts we've written, and we couldn't find that, because I think there might be a misunderstanding. And we'll see about that. We'll figure it out tonight together. The exhibition, Things We Don't Understand, was staged in 2000, and it was a very particular point in time in Austrian history. So this is, I think, one of the very important things to know when looking at something. You know, it was an exhibition, so it was ephemeral, and all that's left is a catalog. And in fact, this catalog is I think sold out. You can't get it anymore. It's not so easy to get, because at the time they staged the exhibition, they didn't figure that we would at one point do Documenta, so it was a small edition. So this is now the carrier of this exhibition, except for the people who've seen the exhibition. Are there any people here who've seen that exhibition? Exactly. So what's left out of this is the historical context of the exhibition. And it's important because this idea of art being somehow not explicable or so, or rendering the excluded, doesn't make sense unless it's staged in in context. And the context there was that we had a change in government. We had, for the first time in the history of the recent Austrian state, the one after the World War, a radical right-wing party elected into government. And this was a shock to a lot of people. There were demonstrations the whole time, every Thursday for at least 4 or 5 months. As you might remember, there was also a reaction by the EU, even though there had been Le Pen. It was before Berlusconi. It was certainly after Thatcher. But the reaction was to boycott of the EU, to boycott Austria for some time. But that came later. At that point, we were all really shocked. And it was also the time when the welfare state was being disbanded. And strangely enough, art was funded very well. In Austria, this has a tradition. Art is funded well because it's somehow tied to culture, and the cultural industry, and cultural industry is tied to tourist industry. So traditionally in Austria, there's a high, artists are getting funded very well, or used to be getting funded very well, and art production was getting funded very well. In fact, we had a very interesting model where 1 or 2 curators, state curators, were able to distribute over €1 million per year to the arts, and completely freely, completely unbureaucratic. And so it wasn't like EU funding or something. So there was this very strange thing happening. That on one hand, we had the right-wing government. The welfare system was being disbanded. A lot of really important structures were being taken down, so that enabled, social justice in Austria. And at the same time, a kind of art was state-funded that was dealing with social issues. And we figured that it was somehow a an excuse in a certain way, because this art had high visibility. It's one of these things that in proportion to what it does politically and in proportion to its input, the art gets a bigger public than other kind of activities, and certainly certain political activities. So it wasn't being talked about that we were losing teachers, we were losing daycare places and so on, and there was a problem with migrants and the exclusion of migrants from unions and all these problems, social problems, loss of work and so on. And at the same time, there was art dealing with people on the street, art dealing with, doing social work, doing collective work, and being state-funded. So that was the context in which we decided to examine the concept of aesthetic autonomy once again, and to take on art that was somehow, all of the artists would portray themselves as being socially engaged in their work, but who were at the same time claiming a space of aesthetic autonomy for themselves, not always explicitly, but implicitly often. And we wanted to see how that would change our view on how we could describe the presence and how we could envision a future. And so this is also something very important and that has kept with us since this exhibition, even earlier exhibitions, all the way through Documenta, that for us to make an exhibition was never about illustrating a point or a theory or concept. It wasn't about representation. It was always about production. It was about trying to use the medium of the exhibition as a way of figuring something out. And in this, the individual artwork was, in a way, a partner, one could say, something that talks back to us and against which we could examine our concepts. And so this has, that sometimes means you have a theory and you make an exhibition and it doesn't work. You figure out it doesn't work. And what is left here is our concept. And we have a few images of the exhibition, but then you don't have the work of art there. So you will have to trust us on some points, or you don't trust us, but you will not be in the same position as someone who went into the exhibition and was able to examine it. The other thing is, it was catered towards an arts public. Generali Foundation is at that point was a kind of hermetic space, an avant-garde space. It did fabulous retrospective of artists that were not so mainstream or were not so, certainly important but not so established. Valley Export, Martha Rosler had one of her first large shows, retrospective shows there. It specialized in public art and sculpture and in feminist art. And it didn't really have a public other than the Viennese art scene. So we catered this exhibition was really trying to start a process of discussion about these issues. How could we get involved politically in the art scene without being banal political? And there were a few discussions within the context of the show that where we hotly debated these issues. And now, from a retrospective point, a lot of what was hot then or important to us then is probably now an established fact or not so new anymore. So we'll see how that will fare. And we hope you will give us input. And by the way, input for me is not just questions. If you want to comment, please comment. And if you want to do it in between, you're very welcome, as long as it's not, what's that word, hustling or heckling? We'd very much like to have this a more open forum if you feel inclined to join us. So do you want to continue?
Yeah. think it is on the one hand, or it was on the one hand, a specifically Austrian tradition. I mean, that social democracy became hegemonic through the cultural sector for decades, and that also had to do with the way, with tourism on the one hand, but also with the way Austria dealt with, or rather repressed, its Nazi past. So the idea, or the projection of a cultured country with a few protagonists, poets, composers, and painters or sculptors who represented the country. But I still think that there is within European social democracy, or what's left of it, this imperative that art is in a certain way useful, or that it can have a kind of functional, that it can follow a functional trait, that it can repair or at least address certain social issues, and that there's also, I mean, implicitly, when art is state-funded, a demand on it to make itself useful. And I think that at that point, the idea of aesthetic autonomy seems, on the one hand, quite appealing. Autonomy. But on the other hand, I mean, every category we are using comes with a heavy baggage. So this is a term, I mean, like any term we are using, that has a history. And the history is ambiguous, I mean, to say the least. I mean, it comes out of a Kantian paradigm where the bourgeois civil sphere started to differentiate itself, and we are not going to run, I mean, into this whole history. But it can be said, or it has to be said, that in particular in Germany and in Austria, in countries where bourgeois revolution failed in 1848, the whole cultural sector became a kind of bypass to let's say, government or authentic political activity, exercising power in the true sense. And the whole history of the Kunstverein you have in Germany, and of literary circles, the feuilleton you have in Germany and Austria, cannot be conceived without this history of a kind of political sublimation in mind. And this is where the crux of the concept of aesthetic autonomy lies, actually. That on the one hand, you claim to be free of something, but that also means that you are really free of it, which becomes a problem, because you don't have a vocabulary, or you don't have the categories, or you don't have the forms in order to make claims to power. And it's actually quite interesting to see, I mean, when you look at it art historically, how a painter like Jacques-Louis David, for example, in France, who was on the one hand the father, I mean, this is how you read it in art historical textbook of French classicism, oscillated or ran around between these committee meetings he had after the French Revolution and his studio practice, and the way those committee meetings informed actually the style he created. And this is and this was an idea that was kind of relevant for us, or is still relevant for us, to see those two things not as in a dichotomous way. I mean, making politics. Also, I mean, the time of committee meetings, where you are always threatened when you are absent to be guillotined. Between committee meetings and studio practice, so to speak. And there's I think, I don't know how it is in Britain, maybe you can tell us about that or educate us about that, but there's among German artists a very strong nostalgia for this idea of the studio as a kind of political cell where practices of subversion are dreamt up, but the problem is, of course, that you are never capable to address the masses the way Malevich could do this in 21, but not later, of course. So we are also dealing in this exhibition, I think, with this whole story of the political dream of artistic work, and the. Do you want to intervene? No. But we also, I mean, as curators, you are always supposed to come up with a solution, or at least with a proposal. I mean, when you say that we don't make exhibition to represent something, we can represent a problem, then we do exhibitions to find something out. So this was actually Austria 2000, this ethnocentric right-wing government, was actually our 1789 moment, or our Vitebsk 1921 moment, where there was suddenly a relationship between artistic practice, or at least the imagination of a relationship between artistic practice and a political movement, where people were on the street and where there were issues, concrete issues, where there were strikes, where public buildings were boycotted, and so on and so forth. And the proposal we came up with was to redefine aesthetic autonomy and not to understand it any longer in this Greenbergian sense as a property of an artwork that is autonomous. I mean, think of your Barnett Newman or Ed Reinhardt or whatever, modernism in its truest spirit. But to think of autonomy as an effect, as something that takes place in the viewer's mind, and that takes place in the viewer's mind not only on an individual level, where you have again this bourgeois who contemplates a painting or a sculpture and gets somehow kicked or becomes sensually thrilled, but then goes back to his office and fires half of the employees. But where you have this element of mobilization, where you have the imagination or the idea of a space that is created in a physical sense, but most of all, I think, in an intellectual sense, where you are allowed to speculate about the way or the conditions of existing human, social, political relations in the way they connect with aesthetic relation or with artistic form. So I think that was the proposal, and that was what was taken up also by the artist. And at that point, the exhibition became a quite interesting but also challenging process, because it was done explicitly with an audience in mind.
I think maybe what seems important, I think I think it's actually historical as well. It's a particular time when we thought that change would have to be at the foundation of meaning making. So change would not be a question of majority raising or political might, but that actually in order to change our perspective on reality, but also to formulate a space of freedom or getting freedom, would mean that we disassemble the whole system of how meaning is made culturally and psychically and socially, and reassemble it. And that comes still, as you all will know, from the 70s ideas and the semiotic ideas, and also went in our personal history via film theory, especially feminist film theory, and the whole analysis of how our ways of perception function with certain norms, social norms, and how we are actually, for instance, have difficulty to accept things we perceive, or even people we perceive, as different from ourselves. So that it's psychically almost impossible to think of things we don't know yet. Things we don't know are in that way also things that we might want to know. Not only those things we can't know, but also things that we don't know, but we might need to know. So the proposal was that aesthetic autonomy allowed us to get to this foundation of representation, because within aesthetic, the concept of aesthetic autonomy is, of course, that it is an effect of this problem of indecidability between form and meaning, so that you can never end up with a fixed meaning. That there's an oscillation. It's also the definition of art in this very classical way, that there's an oscillation where whenever you get one step closer to meaning, it escapes you, and it shifts forms in a certain way. That's quite a classical definition, I would say, and the new idea was to connect it to politics, and the new idea was to connect it really to perception of the viewers, and even to say maybe there must be some collective aspect to this. And that was something that actually, just to lead on in our history, that actually influenced Documenta 12 very much, that we said we need to create a space where this kind of collective perception of an individual work as an aesthetic perception can be potentially combined with a collective talking about this, so that there's this aspect that's actually individual in perception, but this aspect also where an audience comes together. And this is how we then conceived Documenta, or the exhibitions after Things We Don't Understand. In Things We Don't Understand, even though we catered this exhibition towards an arts public, and what would have to say an artists public in Vienna, maybe also a theory public, but it's not so much about collectors or art market in Vienna. It was at that point very much an artist-run community. It was surprisingly popular. The exhibition had, I think, 5 times more people than other exhibitions by Generali Foundation, and they did public questionnaires and found out that the reason was because the title appealed to people. Ordinary, so-called ordinary lay people felt that they were understood in their relationship to contemporary art. That this idea that it's something that is not understandable is somehow right. Now you have to realize that there is a difference in England to other places. Here, even people who are not interested in art know who Damien Hirst is because it's a pop culture figure. I mean, some artists have this pop culture value, and art with frieze and so on has this pop culture aspect to it. But in 2000 in Vienna, that was certainly not the case. So contemporary art was certainly something that was rather alienating to people. And somehow, without us intending to do so, we appealed with this title. And people felt actually enabled to encounter things. They were activized to encounter these things they did not understand. And that was also something that carried over to Documenta, that we said actually people are much more able, as long as you give them certain tools, much more able to deal with things that, and deal with the fact that they will not understand everything, because how could they? They're not experts on it. Then a lot of other curators will, or other people will think so. So there was a gap bridged in a certain way between a lay audience and a specialized audience, but not intentionally. It wasn't our intention, and it wasn't curated that way. In fact, it was in a way almost curated for the artists we showed. It was a way of engaging in a discussion with the artists we showed, and maybe we can show some images or.
I think we should devote a bit more time to the title and to the elements the title consists of, because I mean, a title can be part of a PR strategy. It's a way. I mean, an institution signals significance to the audience. Sometimes exhibition sounds like space as medium, something like that, and remain within this kind of formalist vocabulary. Sometimes they have those deliberately weird titles, like your current exhibition at the moment, where really everyone knows what it is about. Well, can I say this? No. It should be excluded by the title, such a claim. But there is no ambiguity, because the ambiguity is so enforced. I mean, that's what I mean. So you are pushed in the direction of the unknown. And but Dinge, die wir nicht verstehen, there are at least, I think, three categories that are very important. Two are Dinge, things, and there's an Adorno's aesthetic theory, a long speculation, where he's thinking if artworks are actually things among things, and where he tries to figure out in what sense artwork are specific or can be identified in their thingness, because it's obvious. There's no way, I mean, to simply assume this thingness. I'm with the proudness of Sotheby's, for example. I mean, where you have something you can take home if you manage to pay for it. But you can also not do away with it. I mean, this is also one of the lessons of conceptual art, that the more you work against the thingness of the thing, the more it becomes apparent, even if it's just a yellowish paper.
Yeah.
With the
just be reminded that institutions like Tate Modern are actively dealing with this question of how to collect performance art and how to show performance art, so that even something that's as ephemeral, time-based, performative can be made into a thing.
Yeah. And therefore manipulated, also in the way I think things are catalogued and written into history or written out of it. The second notion of the thing is a Lacanian one, la chose, And again, I mean, I won't go into it because it would take another 4 hours, I mean, at least to explain those weird psychoanalytic concepts. But I think that you should know that we are aware of them. And the thing in psychoanalysis is more or less like on this photograph of Alejandra Riera. I mean, it's a contemporary version of the Black Square. It's basically nothing, because Lacan was interested in the way we as human subjects project ourselves retrospectively or retroactively into some kind of identity. And you know those familiar psychoanalytic terms where you have this originary loss of the relationship with the mother, which creates a lack, and then this lack is filled with something, with a pet and with a lover, or with a racing car, or whatever, or with art for some people. But Lacan was interested actually in the structural component of this relationship between lack and desire. And his proposition was that it's actually that the mother is actually not the originary object that is lost, but that she is just like the racing car or art or a lover or a pet, a stand-in for something that is much more originary and is constitutive of our subjectivity. And this weird, mysterious thing that we cannot name or define or substantiate, only in a very arbitrary or contingent way, because your pet looks different from my pet, but we all had pets, so there's something universal here. This is what I wanted to say. Well, anyway, this thing that we cannot substantiate, but it's there, informs us in the way we function as human subjects, and also is a very important element when we start to question actually the way we function. So it's not only psychoanalysis in this therapeutic effect when you are ill and want to find out what your psychic defects are, but it also functions in your healthy life. So and this element, this thing, is also in this title, because what's so important in the exhibition experience, I think, especially when it comes to also to the collective aspects and meaning production and irritation, that it's. I think you said in the introduction that it can be comfortable, maybe, to get irritated. But for most people, I think it's not comfortable at all. It's horrible. And disorientation creates panic. I mean, there's this connoisseur type who loves to be disoriented because he or she knows that they're in a safe environment, it's art, and it's thrilling. But then when we get out, I mean, we are so saturated in our life, it's also secure, that it does not really harm. Does not really harm to people. And of course, I mean, this is also a kind of trap artists want to escape, that they can shock people only in those enclosed environments, ICA, Tate Modern, I don't know how they are called, Saatchi Collection, whatever, but that they are acting like beasts in a zoo. I mean, like a tiger who makes roar, but there is this, but they are still imprisoned and everyone knows it. Except people who go for the fantasy. And then the third aspect has to do with verstehen, understanding. Because there's also this common attitude among people that they think they can understand art, or that they have at least an idea, or that they want to understand art. And this is also, I mean, for curators, an irritating thing. Basically, I mean that people who not even understand their own life want to understand art, and And at this Dinge, die wir nicht verstehen, we had a kind of model situation. Because there we were confronted, I mean, on the one hand with a right-wing government, but we were also confronted with anti-visual cultural theorists who attempt to make every aesthetic phenomenon kind of politically compatible. I mean, with their political theory, which changes every 5 years. It was Foucault, then it was Rancière, now it's Badiou, and next
You forgot Agamben in between.
Okay, I forgot Agamben. Okay, so this was also a kind of resistance. I mean, that needed to be addressed and dealt with.
But I remember quite strongly that at that time, for us, this idea that there's a safe place, maybe, was really important. And we adamantly claimed the white cube as a space for experimentation and a space where certain things could be thought. And we said it's not, and where one could be political. And that actually enraged a lot of people who thought it was only on the streets where you could become political. In fact, we didn't just have a white cube in that. We had this very, one could say, modernist building with cement structured walls, and that was like a temple to avant-garde art. It wasn't white, but it had all these aspects of making ephemeral work that wasn't that was actually quite fragile. And the Gordon Matta Clark cuttings, stuff that in other places would not be seen as art. It would give them credibility, and it would give them the aura, or this surrounding where they could actually do their work. So we didn't only have this architecture, but in fact we created almost like an inversion of the black Mecca. What's that called? Kaaba. Like the black Kaaba, we created a Kaaba in the exhibition that wasn't accessible. We made an architecture that took out a major part of the center of the exhibition space and closed it off. So that if you didn't know the space well, you didn't even realize that there was a space left out. It was in the center and it was a cube, and it was not accessible. It was just taken away. Of course, as if any of you are curators, you know that often these ideas have more than one reason. So one reason was how we justified it. It was inconceptually, but it was also because we really wanted to create spaces for the works that were not so sacred. And we had a problem with this space, with the dominance of the space, so we figured out a way to make the space more winded, like well, you'd move into a cave. In a way, you would get deeper and deeper into the exhibition. And if you wanted to leave again, you had to go back. You couldn't go out. You had to follow back through your space. So it was a journey into the inner life. I don't know if you know that Robert Smithson cave painting, where he has a cinema in the, where he's a cave. It actually also looks like a vagina, and in the end of the cave there's a cinema, and it's his cinema space. And we had at the end a work by Harun Farocki. It was one of the video works that worked in that same way. So it was also a psychoanalytic. We tried to have this kind of influence the subjectivity of how the work was being perceived. And this is another thing I think that's important about the exhibition, was that it wasn't neutral. So even though it claimed to have, it wanted the safe space, it wasn't the white cube in that way of acting neutral. We had, in fact, a lot of text on the wall that wasn't on the wall like you usually have text that's a voice of God or the author or the objective text. that explains the work. What we had were plates. They were see-through plexiglass plates. And on these plates, we combined texts that were quite not esoteric, that's not the word, but whimsical and poetical, and often didn't make immediate sense with other images. So there were many other images that we added to the actual works. They were images mostly of works of the artists we also showed, but also other images, and it was like our voice. So in a way, we connected works with each other. So we created contexts for works. This came often out of the discussion with the artists themselves. So there was a lot of discussion on how to deal with this. But it wasn't, the exhibition did have this voice of the curators quite openly going as a subtext or so on. It seemed to us important to make this clear that we're talking from a position, and that the reason we're doing this is because we feel we need to connect to a certain group of people and deal with to have in a way a discursive format, but with the words that are visual, with the words that are works of art.
To come back to the to this understanding issue, last remark about this idea. I mean, why people want to understand something. There is, I mean, of course, this element of mystery. I mean, to every artwork that has precisely to do with this unclear relationship between material and meaning. And on the other hand, it's also a psychic attitude. I mean, this idea to want to understand something, and it can be. I mean, it seems benign. I mean, when someone comes humbly to the artwork and wants to understand it, but it can also be a kind of very sadistic attempt to swallow something that is different from oneself while preserving one's own integrity. So this is what is obscene about the project of understanding, or at least ambivalent. And those three things, Dinge, things, and understanding, were basically the tools, I mean, in order to touch the work. And you may find it kind of annoying that we don't show images of this exhibition, but the reason is simple. The images are boring, and they don't get you anywhere, because this exhibition looked like any other exhibition. And the images we brought are images that function in a Nash room, I would say. This, on the one hand, I mean, this negative space we've just seen, and here is another installation shot, this time from Documenta, which deals with similar issues. On the right, you see a photograph of a performance conceived by Graciela Carnevale in '68 in Buenos Aires. And it was a performance where people were invited to a contemporary art gallery, to the White Cube. And at some point, when the room was packed, she locked the door from outside and waited for people to break through the window and escape the situation. No, they didn't. I mean, art people are patient, and it's difficult to activate them. So they hammered on the window, and at some point, a passerby had the courage to throw a stone through the window, and then all those well-dressed people escaped safely. And on the other hand, you have almost from the same period a piece by John McCracken, by a Californian minimalist sculptor, whatever those categories mean, who thinks that he is, with his artistic practice, in contact with UFOs. And one of the...
And as such, he hasn't really been accepted into the minimalist categories. Because it's really narrative art, even though it doesn't look like narrative art. And you have here pieces that, in a certain way, are or could be conceived as being incompatible. And maybe they are. On the one hand, you have a piece where the thingness or the aspect of thingness is quite pronounced and obvious. I mean, almost obscenely obvious. I mean, it would also fall into those categories of Greenbergian autonomy. So this is an object that wants to be perceived excluded from every other relationship. Do you have you seen McCracken's in original? Has any of you seen them? The interesting that's I mean in reproduction they do look like minimalism, but he builds them himself, and they have up to 70 coats of paint, and he I don't know how, you know, in between it's like lacquer painting. So this work is actually somehow in the energy of the piece. It's not it's not like a high finish, cool industrial spray paint, even though it has this high finish, and that is something you cannot reproduce. And then there's another aspect to the works that you cannot reproduce in photographs either, and that has to do with the relation of size to the body. You know, how they're sized differently, very differently from a Donald Judd or so. So I think they're actually quite metaphysical, and not in the sense that the minimalist can be criticized as metaphysical. They're intentionally metaphysical, even though they claim autonomy.
And so what you have on the right hand is a photograph that is conceived as a performance, as a very important step in the development of political conceptualism in Argentina in particular. And it's also, I mean, treated in all anthologies you would find about leaving the white cube. I mean, both in intellectual and practical terms.
Do you know, you have to give some background, do you know Graciela Caravalle and you know Tucumán Arde? I think that's also important that she belongs to a group of artists who did leave the institutional spaces and became very politically active and politicized, but at the same time claimed the space of the avant-garde for the political activism. So they organized an exhibition in the countryside, a place that used to be like a cultural and agricultural center for Argentina, but was really depleted of its resources by industry monopolies, and it resulted in a rise of child deaths and poverty and so on, really horrible during totalitarianism. And they went there and made an exhibition, and it was called the first biennial of the avant-garde, and it was a way to organize with unionists So the exhibition was actually a form of anti-propaganda to the state propaganda at the time, but it used the forms of the art space. Graciela Carnevale is made an archive of this group, Tucumanade, of the work they did in the activities, and part of the archive had to be destroyed because at some point they were afraid that they were going to be captured and people identified on those photos, especially not so much the artists but the journalists and unionists who were involved. And so before they were raided by the police, she destroyed some of the photos. But this archive is now residing in a MACBA in the museum in Barcelona. It's one of these things that seem to be important to recent museum activity to make a big emphasis on collecting archives and taking them almost as work.
And the problem, I mean, with the presentation, I mean, to come back to the curatorial disease and how to deal, I mean, with all those investments, is what do you do? I mean, you can tell the story about this event, which was an exemplary event, and then people read 2 pages A4, if they do, and then they have maybe time to look at the photograph too, and you know what they recognize. They recognize what you have written on those pages, and so they don't look for themselves, to put it bluntly. And the same goes for the McCracken, because even though the thing makes itself or dresses itself as if it just fell from heaven or from outer space, it comes, I mean, on the one hand, with a conceptual history, but it has also in itself time of artistic practice, I mean, that is condensed in this cube. So what about this combination? And this would get us near, I think, to this question of confusion, and how people are actually relating things, and how to do justice to the context the people, the things come from, or are taken from. And because it's quite clear, I mean, that the context cannot be or should not be ignored, because it creates a resistance to your own reading of the piece. And on the other hand, I mean, when you fetishize it, then the piece becomes a footnote to a certain political history. So the Turner Prize winner is announced. Yeah. Getting first-hand information. And those, I mean, those are issues that I think are most pertinent, I mean, to the questions of autonomy, because those are the categories that are most deeply felt with the audience and with the potential of the audience, I mean, to educate itself about pieces, I mean, while walking through an exhibition and while taking things in. And what we did here at Documenta, and it was one of the reasons why we were called criminals, not without reason, I have to say, by doing those weird and completely irresponsible juxtapositions, was to have an image and to re-narrativize it. So you have this lady climbing, I mean, through the broken shop window of the gallery, liberating itself, I mean, from the weight and the terror of the white terror of the white cube, just ending up again in an art space. So this is a kind of the actualization of a photograph. And it's also a way, I mean, to recontextualize the John McCracken as something that can only function in a context that is perceived to be an art context. And I mean, this is just one modest example of how to deal with those, I mean, different aspects of thingness, of understanding, of those kinds of projections people have, of how they perceive things and how they relate. Where what I find so important, and this would be my final remark, I think, tonight, is that what is created, I think, by those juxtaposition is conflict. So I think it's in fact what you are doing, or what a good exhibition is doing, is that it really makes people very passionate and very emotional, because they have to connect, I mean, to the thing they carry with themselves, and it would be too intellectual, I mean, to associate this thing only with modes of perceptions, or the category we have learned about what is autonomous art, what is applied art, what is Western art, what is non-Western art, what is good art, what is bad art, and so on and so forth. So I think that that to talk about autonomy as an effect, I mean, the true effect of the autonomy is that it creates among the audience a huge crisis. And where people, I mean, it's not just about the crisis. I mean, it's not about making people confused and psychotic, but also to have an element within the exhibition that is a proper element of the exhibition where this crisis can be settled, so to speak.
But I think as we started with the context of things we don't understand, and now you have the example of Documenta, I must add that we were greatly helped with our Documenta concept by the context of Documenta. We knew that of those 750,000 people who came to visit this show in 100 days, over 90% would be lay audience. And for a lay audience, there is not much difference between not knowing or not understanding a McCracken and a Brasilia Carnevale. So that in a way, everything would be new. Also, research has been done that a lot of the visitors coming to Documenta don't go see any other contemporary art shows. So that they really don't have the conventional mainstream arts knowledge. I don't know whether that was your experience. We have someone in the audience who was working with public, groups of public. In that way, certain prejudices about what is known or what we do understand and what we have the categories for, and what we don't understand and we don't have the categories for are irrelevant. And they wouldn't be irrelevant, and they wouldn't have been relevant to a show like things we don't understand, where you have a particular audience. So that both the narrativization that we did and that we called migration of forms in Documenta 12, and also the lack of knowledge were in correspondence or in context of this lay audience, where we were saying that no way would we even be able, if we attempted to supply audience with this context, rather than making visible this lack and making clear that there's a problem with this lack of knowledge, and that it is frustrating when you don't have the means to interpret a work. We would, I lost my thread, but narrativization, and it was possible to create new contexts in this way. And sometimes they made more sense, and sometimes they made less sense, or they made sense in different aspects. Sometimes they were quite illustrative, sometimes they were formal. There were different ways of connecting and narrativize. and to leave an audience with this frustration or with this situation where they would really have to work in order to get things was possible. And it wouldn't have been possible if it had been an audience that would discriminate more between what is known and what is unknown. In fact, one of the things you can see, I don't think empirical research has been done, but I would still think that if it was done, you could actually prove it, and was that the more professional the audiences got, the more problematic it was for them that we included work that to them were perceived of as not good art or not art. So that the categories were then in place, and the lack of context became something that was actually hindering the acquisition of knowledge or the acquisition, even the aesthetic experience. Whereas I think that this lack of knowledge to the lay audience either resulted in them not being able to even get into it, or if they decided to accept the challenge, there was this experience that they would work and really actively work at starting to acquire even the knowledge. I mean, people would research. There were people who came back and over the period of 100 times became quite experts in certain particular works or constellations of works they were interested in. So in that way, it would be interesting to hear your experience about that, because we've never talked about it. But in that way, I think that context does matter, because it does determine how an exhibition can be perceived. But it's not always this one-on-one context of the literal, social, or historical period or environment.
So we tried to answer your questions about the inexplicable and the unknown and the repressed and all those things, and we tried our best, but what you never know if it helps.
Are there comments, questions? Alice Kreischer, who appeared in Things We Don't Understand as Alice Ohneland, and she had a huge painting there that was like a salon painting, and it took Courbet as its model. I don't know if you have a photograph of that. And there's so many things on there that are explained, but there are many, many, many things on there that are not, I don't get, and they're all references. And I asked her, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about this fact that there are certain people of your inside colleagues who've worked with you on this painting, who can decipher it and others not? And she said it doesn't matter, because there's not just one perspective on that. So there are different kinds of levels of getting it or understanding, and that's okay, she said. And I think that my experience with a lay audience was, in fact, that there are different levels of engagement. And I also think it's really important, why should someone get something if they don't work at it, or it's not part of their life? I mean, I think this is a problem of this is it's a problem that becomes a problem for political artists, of course, because they want to be effective in a way, but maybe it's not a one-on-one effectiveness that's so interesting. So so sometimes what affects you happens years after. That would be so I don't think it's about this being comfortable that your friends will understand it, and it doesn't matter so much that others might not understand it, or this outsider thing. Yeah.
But there's also a conflict, of course.
Horrible conflicts.
I feel very ambiguous about that, because I mean, on the one hand, I love to be on my own, because then I'm never challenged. And I mean, it would mean that I wouldn't develop or evolve as a human being. I would rather regress, but I would certainly enjoy it. Even if I would become.
But I don't let him.
So when you work or when you collaborate with people, then this kind of coherence is permanently being undone. So your narcissism is always not only challenged but actually destroyed, and this is horrible. So there's probably no alternative to it, but still it's horrible. And so I think that if people are aware that there is this kind of transference and counter-transference going on, and they master the ethical discipline, not to kill each other, but also not to become consensual or servile, which also happens. If you work with weak people who just admire you, and then you actually think that as a Documenta director you are someone special, and if you manage, those kinds of friendships or relationships of mutual understanding, I think this is very. This is just. This is very precious.
Sorry.
And this is also one of the key areas, I think, where ethics and aesthetics meet. And I would also argue, even if I couldn't prove it now, I would have to think about it, that this is something that also informs the exhibition or the practice. So I think it becomes a bit more tender without getting weak. More porous and maybe also more risky.
There are two things. One is Documenta is an alienating experience. It's for the people working there. It's really, even if they work together really well, it becomes a big machine that's not controllable and that does certain things to people. And I know a lot of people who worked there who took 2 years to even become normal again, and some people never become normal. So I think it has to do with all the mismaking, with the level of attention it gets, with a lack of infrastructure and the lack of money that is quite severe. In fact, the last Documenta was done with 1.5 million. The exhibition itself, everything else went into people and infrastructure. So it was a low-budget show in a certain way, and people don't realize that because the overall budget is almost 20 million, but that goes over a period of 5 years into people power.
And toilets and everything.
Yeah, because they're not even, that is just one of these things that just means that to even survive and open on time is completely great. It's unclear. Everyone who's survived it knows what we're talking about.
But we're not forced to do it.
No, it's a complete. Everyone enters into it, and some people are even informed because they've worked with it before. Some artists are even informed. Alejandra Herrera did 2 Documentas. There are many artists who did 2 Documentas who still, there's this problem of alienation. But the artists I want to talk about, you could say that this working of intimately is also something that a lot of curators do with artists. So even if they're individual, a lot of the ideas and the knowledge comes from artists, and this interaction with artists. That's a very traditional model, but it's a model that functions very well, which is one of the reasons why we've done many exhibitions with the same artists over and over again, because over the years it becomes also you develop a language together. And so an exhibition is always also an opportunity to continue a dialogue with someone. But I think that for me personally, there's not so much difference between the works of art and the people I work with. And that might be complete projection on my part. But nevertheless, this kind of exchange of ideas works for me, even if it's a projection between myself and the works. So a lot of what one comes up with comes through the works, and we didn't show this for things we don't understand, but each of the works in the exhibition took a certain relation to the world, and that actually helped us, enabled us to think of this aesthetic autonomy in different aspects and use these concepts to form new categories of how we would think of political activation of a public. So that comes a lot out of work, and I think that most curators work that way. I don't know, but certainly for me, that's I believe that the artworks in themselves have something to say, and even though it might not be objective, it's material. So that it is something that you can refer to, and you can also refer to, if we have a fight about something or a conflict, a dissent, then there's still this work that we have to refer to, and we have to somehow find a way of relating our concepts to this work. Well, I think the problem starts for the artist when the work leaves the studio. And when the work leaves the studio, they lose control over what it means. And it's a huge problem for many artists, and some of them try to control the meaning, and they become very adamant about it. James Coleman, for instance, he did this huge work at Documenta, and there were some fans, and they were probably students, and they stayed in this room, and there's this. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's a film, and Harvey Keitel is standing among fake ruins, antique ruins, and he talks, and it doesn't add up. I mean, it has some parts of, like Shakespeare, it has some parts of Homer, it has some parts of James Coleman, and it's really about the loss of the phallus and whatever, but it doesn't really, it's English, but it doesn't really add up to make sense, finally. And in this process of trying to understand, some students copiously try to get the dialogue, which is not published anywhere, and put it on the internet. And James Coleman found out, and it wasn't done by us, it was just a fan website, and came with lawyers and said, take this off the site and so on. So for him, that control is really important. He tries to exercise it very much. There are many artists who, this was not done against the artists. There were certainly, within things we don't understand, we wanted to show work by Alejandra Riera that was about Leyla Zana, who was a Kurdish politician who was thrown into prison because she spoke Kurdish in parliament, and that's not allowed. You're not allowed to speak this language. So she was thrown into prison, and then Alejandra identified very much with this political problem, and she's an amnesty case and so on. And Riera did a huge work on her, and it took her 5 years. And she showed it in some places, and then we wanted to show it in things we don't understand. And she said, I don't want to show it because meanwhile, Leyla Zana is still in prison, in fact, because she wrote a letter calling for uprising of PKK, she was sentenced again, and she was sentenced to be in prison until 2011. Now, this show was in 2000, right? So she had already been in prison for quite some time. And Rera said, I put this work up as it is now, this is really fetishizing. You know, this woman is still in prison. I did this work in order to get her out of prison. I cannot put up this work. And so she changed the work, and out of this work made another work. So in that way, you're not working against the artists, you're working with the artists. I don't know about downstairs because I haven't been part of this program. In Documenta, it was a very large show, and of course there are certain positions of artists, mostly those called, what are they always called, emerging artists? Those are actually established artists, mostly emerging artists, but they're not in the £200,000 region, only in the £100,000 region or something, you know. This is a really fake category, this emerging artists. Mostly white American, US American artists with whom there was this problem, I do have to say. But there were many other artists who actually felt that our way of curating was doing the work good, and they like to have seen, you know, because a lot of artists actually like to have their work interpreted. So there's, you know, there are different artistic positions towards this problem of control of meaning of their work. For some work, it's really important that the meaning is very precise and stays the same. For other work, it isn't important. So artists like Juan Davila, for instance, were really happy to be shown in this vein. So I don't think that there's one way of dealing with this, because the artist's position and their work are so different from each other. But I would agree with you that it's a power relationship, although I wouldn't say that the artists are without power. And in the case of Documenta, it becomes a problem because it's very difficult for artists to say no. There were artists who said no. Katie Nolan said no. I think she's one of the best artists ever. She said no. Kai Althoff said no. So there are artists who say no, we're not going to deal with this. There are also people who were invited for the directorship of Documenta and said no. They said they refused to compete. So it's a power relationship. There is the possibility to say no, and there are also in-between possibilities. But I think that as a curator, you need to be aware of that, and it would be unethical to show work with living artists without somehow at least engaging in a dialogue with the artists about this.
So then you should also not be afraid of conflicts. Yeah. Because there's no guarantee, I mean, that the dialogue will be constructive.
One of the things I'm thinking of is that also meanings do change over time as public change, and the interests of public are change. So that's also a historical fact. So the historical context of a work is not just the authentic original context, but the uses of the work, and we have that within art history. When we have a work that has been done for a church and suddenly ends up in a museum, and you have that in this show in the National Gallery, where this
sacred made real.
The sacred made real, where there's now you could say that this is a problem that it loses this context, but I think that
this is a good example. I think this sacred made real. Have you seen the exhibition? No? You only go to contemporary shows? you shouldn't. But it shows, I mean, that this is not necessarily a contemporary issue, but it's an issue of, I mean, how to communicate something like a cultural legacy. And there, I mean,
or I must think about work by women in Eastern Europe from the 60s on that was just, in a way, almost structurally excluded from the public sphere. In a way, you would say that the context of this work was, the true context of it was to not to be shown. So, so it's a good way that we have changed our perspectives on this, and that this work is suddenly collected from somewhere else. Now there are certain, I think the way that institutions come into this art is also important. It's not just the curatorial problem, it's also this problem of how does work get made visible, and where is it kept, and how is it possible to develop discussions about it, discussions about this. Documenta 12 took it on by our refusals to give much text at all. We made this quite obvious. We made also the problematic of it quite obvious. It was just our way out of the problem that has come about because the world has gotten bigger since Documenta, the first Documenta, when international was Italy, France, United States, and Germany.
Not the United States.
Wasn't the United States? No, only Documenta 3 had the United States. So we included a lot of works that would not be deemed as art even. We had this garden carpet that's collected. You could claim that it isn't art. This is applied arts. The Vienna has a lot of work that is actually was art, is now applied arts. So I think this is a fact that, as I said, the moment the work leaves the studio is a fact of the work, and the problem is more of how to make it possible for an audience to be aware of this as a part of the meaning making. I mean, are the audience aware of the fact that this could also look different? I think one of the things we did in Documenta was show work by the same artists in different places, as McCracken, for instance, and one of the reasons was to allow a lay audience to become experts in certain ways and to recognize something, or to say, this is, I've seen work by this artist an hour earlier, so to re-encounter something. But another was also to make clear you could re-encounter this in a very different circumstance. So at one point it's connected in a formal way, and the next point it's connected by exact, precise art historical context, because colleagues who've worked together for 30 years are exhibited next to each other. So, so in a way, you can structure an exhibition in such a way as to help the audience actually be aware of the fact that putting together an exhibition is also an act of meaning making. And I think that's all you can do. There's not this true meaning or being true to a work of art.
But it's also an act of making a certain kind of meaning disappear.
The white cube?
Not necessarily the white cube, but also certain modes of reading, especially, I mean, when it comes to this applied art. I mean, making people aware that art is not a universal concept, but a very local and historically very specific concept, for example.
Yeah, or that, this local, that the concept of art is a very local concept, but also that art that we have seen as universal is actually quite local. I mean, we localized McCracken or others because we said the only way we can create a situation where the work that hasn't been seen so much, that comes from farther places, in a way, to Kassel, that it can be equally, that there are categories for this work, or that there can be categories established that are helpful for these works, is by destroying our knowledge in the, or our assuredness that we have the categories. So that the problem with, if you keep your categories, then you always will have minimalism from the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States, and then Indian art. You will not escape that. So one is identified by geopolitical identity, and the other one is identified by your knowledge, your contextual knowledge. That is, that is what you've been brought up with. So we had to find ways, or we tried to find ways to get rid of that by getting rid of certain, and the white cube was certainly one of them, certain categories that seemed, and the other one was by localizing, saying a Zoe Lennart is a locally specific position. It's as locally specific as Abdoulaye Konaté from Africa, from Mali.
Charlotte, did we satisfy your curiosity about?
And just as any just starting to ask one more question, maybe that's.
Do you want to say something about that?
No.
Okay.
Not tonight.
Thank you for coming.
No, your money is used up.
You have to re-put something into the slot, then, Okay, thank you very much for coming and listening to us.